So this is the second part in conclusion to the quarter pole build. Obviously, since it wasn't in the last video, the bulk of this video is going to be showing you how I made the pedestal for this. This is a little different. It's a hexagon instead of a square. I'm thinking of actually changing the description of the video to account for that, just because I have a pedestal build video on the channel. It's one of my more popular videos because anyone that does any sort of photography or displays want to make them because they're oddly expensive to buy. It could be a shipping issue or what have you, but so people always try and DIY them. So I think I want to make the description reflect the fact that this part at least has a pedestal build in it, because I think people might find that useful. But other than that, in general, you could tell this is pretty self-explanatory. The color scheme staying this way. There will be 2 red stripes that will go on the base, but with all the drying times, because it's still cold out, I won't probably get those on for at least another week, because this only has 1 coat of primer on it as is, and I wanted to get the video out. I didn't want to postpone it, so you'll have to use your imagination at that point. But essentially, like I said, the bulk of this video is going to be making this pedestal, and this is essentially what it's going to look like. So to start this, I'm using a 20 by 20 inch square, which is a little bit wider than the widest part of the top ball, which is what I'm going for. And the pedestal is going to be a hexagon, which kind of matches a photo the customer gave me. So I'm just going to be refolding this a couple times. This will give me center lines through the piece. They come in handy down the line for everything, and it will be what I initially draw my angles off of. So you could see with one of those lines dissecting the square I have, I'm going to be marking 60 degrees, because for hexagons the inner angles are 60 degrees, the outer angles are going to be 120. So on both sides I'm just going to be marking 60. I'm doing top and bottom, so I have 2 marks to draw my lines off of, and then I'm just going to extend these through the top of my piece of paper here. So you can see I'm left with those 2 marks going up as well as 2 marks going down, and then all of the fold marks as well. Once I have those on the outside, I'm just connecting all of my lines, and that is what is going to give me the hexagon. So this is pretty simple. I end up tweaking this a little bit. I don't end up using this one because I decided I wanted 2 of my sides to be wider. Right now these sides are all pretty similar. It's pretty close. So then this is the newer one I drew, and you could see all I'm doing is I'm extending some lines so that 2 sides are longer than the others. That was just because I am working off of a photo of what this stand should look like, the quarter marker pole. And it looks like in the photo 2 of the sides are a little bit longer than the others. And then I just marked my angles roughly, but what I decided to do was to trim out the edge pieces, so I had guides to make the hexagon with. Angles, at least for myself, can get a little confusing, so I do like to work off of solid pieces. So all I did, you could see, was I marked where they should go. I used the bevel gauge to transfer that angle onto an adjustable miter I have for my crosscut sled, and I could cut that angle. So all the angles are the same, except for obviously 4 of them will be different because they're not all equal sides. But you could see I cut those 2 edges, and then I have solid pieces to work off of. Once that was done, I propped those pieces up so I could get really accurate marks. You could see I marked on those pieces, and then I could cut these angles as well. Same process. I transfer that angle to a bevel gauge, and these are obviously the same angle. It's the 4 in the center which are going to be different, and then I have all of those angles so I could cut the pieces for when I make the pedestal. I marked 2 as my master. I'm only going to be working off of 2, just in case there's little undulations in the pieces. It will always be the master I'm working off of. And then just more so for the sake of this video, so this makes a little bit of sense, I'm going to take those 2 angles. One's 54 degrees and the other is 75 degrees.
subtracting that from 90 because the angle on my table saw only goes up to 45. So that's how you do that on the table saw. You subtract what you have from 90, and I got my 2 new angles, and those are the 2 angles that will make up all the sides of the piece. I could use the master. You could see I'm using that, as well as the bevel gauge, to make sure it's accurate. I could set my fence based off that master, and then I could cut 4 of these pieces. I'm using 1/2 inch MDF because I had it laying around from a table I made in the fall. I've made these out of 3/4, and that does get fairly heavy. I had the 1/2 inch, so that's what I decided to use. So pretty simple. You could see I'm just slicing this down, and like I said, 4 of these sides are the same, and then the 2 long sides. So I'm cutting 4 of these to start, and then I'm flipping this over for the new angle because I cut the first angle. And then I could rip the other side. Once again, you can see I'm using the master to make sure everything lines up. And then I have my 2 angles cut. So these 4 pieces will have, I believe, what did I say, 72 degrees, as well as the 54, I believe, was the other 1-degree angle on there. And then for the 2 longer pieces, same process. Because I'm cutting these in sections, this angle's set up properly, because where the 2 pieces meet, it is actually the exact same angle, but it's just wider. So you can see I'm just fixing the fence so it's wider. You clamp it in place, and then cut those 2 longer sides. This would have been easier to make this an equilateral hexagon, but that wasn't really what the project called for. So that's why there is more adjustments. So if all these angles were the same, obviously it would be a little bit easier. And then I could cut these the 2 wider pieces. Flip it over and cut it again. And then I just put this together with a strap clamp to make sure that this was actually going to work. I was really happy. What I'm looking for is that all my angles meet, not only in the top, but I have no big gaps in the sides, and I really didn't, which was nice. And then I even put the pattern on top. With my pattern on top, it was pretty accurate. My floor's not level, which is why it was a little wonky, but it worked out quite nicely. Now this MDF was a little over 4 feet. And the piece itself is 28 inches, and they only wanted it about, give or take, 6 feet tall. So I had to trim down all of these pieces by just a little bit. So on the inside, I'm going through this quickly because these measurements change. On the inside of this, I'm actually building a wooden frame. That is because since I'm only using 1/2 inch MDF, and because this topper that's going on there is 50 pounds, I wanted there to be an inner frame which held the bulk of the weight. If this was something for myself, I really think that pedestal could hold up the weight, but I didn't want to chance it for a customer. So I had essentially these 1-bys laying around the shop from the built-in I just did. This is the wood I took out of the room. I saved it. Which means it's already nice and dried out because that built-in was from the 80s. These pieces weren't all perfectly the same sizes, so you could see I'm ripping down 2 sizes to make them all the same. So it was pretty quick work, and it was essentially free lumber. So once I had that stack, I cut down my heights, which was 45.5 inches, and then here I am cutting down my base pieces. Like I said, I ended up changing this because I didn't account for the thickness of the MDF, which is why I kind of sped through those dimensions in the beginning. And then I'm going to be joining this all with lap joints. This is obviously more work than just screwing everything together, but while what lap joints lack in aesthetics, they make up for in the fact that they're one of the strongest joints you could use when building. So you can see I'm just raising the blade on the radial arm saw in order to cut on my laps. I'm going halfway through all of my pieces and the thickness of my pieces. So there's easier, faster ways to do this, but I like to do it with the radial arm saw. It's very simple to set up. And then I'm just going to cut a series of curves on 2 sides of all of those pieces. I could clean this. This is pine, so I could clean it up very easily with a chisel. And then I'm left with a nice half lap. I could join all those together, and then there is my base. So this will be super sturdy, and obviously there's going to be a top and a bottom for this. Like I said, the laps aren't the prettiest joint, but they're super strong. Now for all of the vertical pieces, I want most of the weight to be sitting on top of the piece, so I'm going to be cutting very, very deep laps on those. So once again, I'm just transferring the height of this onto there to mark where the laps are. It's a little bit taller, and then I lowered the blade for this because you could see I'm only leaving about a 1/4 inch of material down there. I wanted that 1/4 inch of material for gluing surface, but like I said, the way that this is going to work is the gravity is going to be pushing down on the piece, so I want the bulk of that to be sitting on my frame. Then while halfway through building this, I realized I didn't account for the thickness of the frame, so I had to adjust everything by about a 1/2 inch. You could see I marked all my pieces. I only had to cut one side. Stuff like this is a little bit of a pain. It happens. It took about 10 minutes to fix. And now you could see this will fit perfectly inside that pedestal. Gave myself about a 1/4 inch leeway on either side. And then I could glue this all together. The reason these joints are so strong is because you have a lot of gluing surface. The more you can add to your gluing surface is just going to add to the strength. And then I could go through and add all of my verticals. Everything's going to be clamped together as it dries. Don't have any hardware in this. And then at the top, same thing, I could add my frame onto those verticals as well as clamp everything into place. So then to glue up the hexagon, I knew this was going to be a pain, and it really was. That is because the way that you glue this is you put tape on your flat side. So I had to kind of tape it on the flat side and then flip it because I knew it would be too heavy to flip all 6 panels at once. And then you should be able to add glue and then just attach all the pieces, but the weight of this was just too heavy for the painter's tape. If you make these smaller, you can see as I'm lifting it kind of wants to pull apart. I used some propane tanks to kind of help with that. I was able to get it in place, as you could see, and get a strap clamp on the bottom, but the blue tape is starting to pull off. But I did get one strap clamp on the bottom, and then I moved it vertically, was able to strap up the rest of it, and there's kind of glue everywhere because this was a little bit of a pain. I've made forms like this in smaller sizes and it's very easy to do. It was just the weight of it made it a little bit harder. Obviously squares are easier than hexagons as well. So then I didn't have any MDF left, but I had 1/2 inch birch veneer ply. So I traced the frame of the top. It's a little bit smaller than I needed, but that won't really matter in the end. This is the piece I had and I didn't want to buy new material. I roughly cut it out with a jigsaw. So then I put 2 brads in the top, and I'm going to use a flush cut bit in order to get this perfectly the same dimensions as the top side of the hexagon. There's a bearing on these bits that will ride against the MDF and transfer that dimension to the plywood. These orange bits I use are not the best graded bits, so you could see that's one of the reasons you remove the bulk of the material with a jigsaw. And then I'm just going to slowly, gradually cheat up onto this dimension with that bit and go around the whole piece, and then the top will be perfect. You see it matches all of my sides perfectly. Now I did it this way because that's what I decided to do, but you could cut. Now I'm going through with a 45 and adding a 45 on the inside edge. I'll add a 45 on the inside edge at the top, and that's how they'll mate. Now you could cut these 45s on the table saw. I decided to try it out with the router this time. I didn't dislike it. It was a little bit easier than cutting the 45s on that irregular shaped top on the table saw as well. But that's the 45. I'm just using a chamfering bit to do that because the chamfering bit I have is 45 degrees. Now for the top it gets a little tricky because I need to cut on the underside, and the hole on the plate for my router isn't wide enough, so I had to take it off. It's not the safest cut to make, but in order to get this done, that's what I had to do. And then the strips I made originally as jigs for my frame came into handy because I needed something thicker than what I had for that bearing to ride against. So you can see I added that bits of frame on the bottom, and then the bearing will ride against the bottom, and I could cut that chamfer. The chamfer is on the bottom side of the top, obviously, to mate with the top of the hexagon. But there's what that looks like, and then I could just pry off those pieces I added. And then that's how that fits. You could see how those 45s mate up. There was a little bit of sanding to do on the MDF because the corners I didn't get perfectly square, but MDF is super easy to sand, which is one of the benefits of it. Before I glued this all in place, I added a 1.25 inch dowel hole into the bottom of the ball piece as well as the base. I'm going to glue that dowel into the base, and that's how that will set on top. You can see with the 1.25 inch piece, since it didn't go all the way through, you have to use the hole saw and then drill out the bits. I don't have an 1.25 inch spade bit. That would have worked as well. But you can see I'm left with 2 mating holes. And then I had to sand a little bit so you could see that they pieced together this as well. It wasn't one solid piece of mahogany. It looked like they had an inner square and then mahogany on the outside. Then I could go through and sand the MDF with 120 grit sandpaper. So since this is for about 4 feet and 4 feet, the customer will have to do this as well. You're going to have to tilt the pedestal and then slide in the frame. The frame fits in there just about perfectly, and then the top now can be glued into place. You can see how that frame's just at the top. Everything, the frame I calculated so that was there, so that when you put this topper on, like I said, the wooden frame is holding the bulk of the weight at this point. And then I could just glue this into place, add some brads, and then that's what my pedestal looks like. Now in the photo, there's some bits of molding on the top. It's a little hard to make out what they look like. It's kind of had to play it by ear. I didn't want to add super thick pieces, so I'm using some 1/4 inch oak ply I had laying around the shop. I cut the 2 long sides first. These are the same angles as when I cut the originals, so once again I'm using those jig pieces in order to get the angles, and that angle is going to be on every side except for the 2 pieces that meet. So for the 2 pieces that meet, you could see I marked where that should be. I cut a test piece on the table saw. I can mark where that is and then cut those angles as well. Those that original jig I made with those scrap strips of 1/2 inch ply, I ended up using them multiple times throughout this build. It was worth the effort. I could go through and cut those shallower angles that are on this inside edge here. These 2 that meet are the 2 angles that are different, and then I could just brad everything into place. There's poplar molding that goes on top of this. I thought I filmed it, I didn't, but you'll see it pop on later in the video. It's the exact same process. And that's what that oak framing looks like on the outside there. So then I started patching stuff. This is where that gap is from where that piece wasn't big enough. What I like to do is take some table saw dust that's laying around the shop, some sawdust, and add glue to it till you get like a peanut butter like consistency. And for bigger gaps, there was a piece where a rotted piece of wood fell out of the ball, as well as the gap here. I fill that with this putty. It's essentially free. Yeah, it's much cheaper than using wood filler. That will dry and it will shrink a little bit, and then I put spackle on top of it for the smaller pieces. So you can see I spackled the whole top of this. This spackle's left over from the built-in I did. I got 15-minute drying time spackle, so the built-in I could sand stuff pretty quickly in that space. You can see how nicely this stuff sands. So like I said, as that original putty I used dries, then I'll go through and put the spackle on top so that it fills in all the gaps. Now what I'm doing here is I have spackle on there, and you could kind of wet sand it with your hand. You make a little bit of a slurry. It's kind of a process you have to get used to. Too wet it doesn't work, too dry it doesn't work. But when it's started to set up, when the spackle gets a little stiff, you could wet your hand like that and rub it, and it essentially wet sands the piece, and then there's very little bit of sanding to do at the end. Then like you can see, I'm spray painting the ball, and then I'm putting primer on the base. Like I said, I'll put another coat of primer. MDF really sucks up primer. I might even do 3 coats, but it's going to be white at the end of the day, so I'm not going to film the whole painting process. Obviously, I filled out my brad nails with spackle as well, and then once this dried, I could transfer the ball on top of it to film the intro. I did scrape the top of the piece a little bit doing that, but I was pretty happy with there's always going to be some more touch-ups to do as well, but once I started painting the base, it became a little difficult to figure out where my patch started and where the original ended, which was the goal of this, so I was pretty happy with that. But even with the first coat of primer on there, you could see everything looks pretty good. A lot of my marks on the top disappear. That's where I scratched it. But the nice thing about primer is if you do see little spots, you can go through and add that spackle again, sand it down, and then just prime over top of it. But I was pretty happy with how this turned out. Going around the piece, that's what the finish will look like. And then just some photos.